Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Spear, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll cover this week's U.S. presidential election results, including its possible implications for Canada and what it signals about the political salience of free markets, limited government, and other long-standing conservative precepts. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
David, if you're a Democrat looking at these results, how do you interpret them? Are the factors behind the party's presidential loss contingent? Is this a story of inflation and some campaign missteps? Or are there aspects of Democratic politics that fundamentally are behind them losing to Donald Trump two of the past three presidential elections?
Yeah. From a Democratic point of view, I think this defeat had three big drivers, one of which is contingent, and that's the inflation, which has wrecked incumbent governments all over the world, and
Yes.
it's wrecking the Trudeau government in Canada.
Yes.
Um, uh, to cope with COVID, governments ran very permissive fiscal and monetary policies. Those have had their consequences 2 and 3 years later, and now everybody has to wind down. Now, the good news for Democrats is as much as people hate inflation, you know what they like less? Disinflation. Uh, and that there's going to have to be some stringency. And the people who do that stringency are going to pay the costs. And that's what Keir Starmer is going to find out in Britain. That's what the next Canadian government is going to find out. And I think that's what the Trump administration is going to find out. So, yeah, inflation, which is going to be squeezed out, that wasn't a choice. That was a choice by the Trump administration because the big stimulus happened under Trump. The
Yes.
inflation followed, and now we're going to clean it up. Second thing, and this is they're doing, immigration. All over the world, immigration is a problem. The Trump administration had very big immigration in its first 2 years, but then put in place a series of measures that controlled unauthorized immigration in the second 2 years. And then there was COVID, which slowed unauthorized immigration some more. The Biden people undid the Trump restrictions. The first article I wrote for The Atlantic after Biden took office was, this is the most important decision he's going to make. And if he makes it wrong, he's going to pay the price. And he indeed, because Biden was always like a party manager and a creature of the Democratic consensus, he didn't have very many of his own ideas. He followed the left of the party, opened the border, and paid the price. So that is something that Democrats need to think about. Immigration needs to be lawful, it needs to be orderly, and you have to stop letting people game asylum as a backdoor way of immigration. Because if your definition of asylum is anyone can come to a rich country if they are born if they are born in a poor country and suffer the usual problems of life in a poor country,
Yes.
then the asylum works for the whole world. The asylum system was designed for people who are being specifically persecuted because of something important and unchangeable about themselves. It was it's not a backdoor immigration system. Okay. So, and the third thing was crime and urban disorder. You'll notice the Democrats did especially badly in ultra blue areas, like seems to have done badly in downstate New York. And that
Yes.
does seem to be a reaction to, again, the post George Floyd relaxation of law and order. Uh, you know, I think the lessons of the inflation is bad. The borders must be controlled. Criminals belong in prison. That's that. If Democrats have three lessons to learn. Now, there are people on the progressive left who are going to think that the answer was that the Democrats needed to be more pro-Hamas than they were. And anyone who's promoting that is either a dishonest person or a moron. But with I would say a slight because, of course, the Trump plan for Gaza is to turn the whole thing into is to pave the thing and turn it into off-site parking for the Suez Canal shippers.
Kamala Harris, David, received considerably fewer votes than Joe Biden did in 2020. Is there a lesson there? Is there something about Biden's political persona that may represent a sweet spot for the Democratic Party?
It's difficult to talk about this tactfully, but I notice that in English-speaking countries, especially Canada and Britain, the first women have been in parties of the right.
Hmm.
Uh, and while parties of the left have stuck with straight white men. And there may be a logic there because you go where you're weak, right? So the conservative parties of the right are weak with women. So symbolic leadership, symbolic openness to women. So if the problem that the Democrats had culturally was that they're seen as a party that is inhospitable to men and male behavior, then um, Harris was the wrong answer to that problem. And maybe I think the way, I mean, Gerald Ford many, many years ago predicted the first female president would be a Republican. I think that prediction is looking strong.
We've been talking about the Democrats. I want to move to the Republicans now. And as a preface to this question, I should just encourage our listeners and viewers to go back and read your book, Comeback. It's a book I've talked a lot about on this podcast, David, because I think it anticipated so many of the political trends that we are now grappling with, and in particular, I'm talking about the political realignment and the
Yeah,
extent to which the Republican parties has this new and evolving voter coalition comprised of non-traditional Republicans. It prompts the question: how do Republicans make themselves responsive to the interests and perspective of these voters without abandoning key conservative commitments about markets, limited government, and so on?
yeah,
Are there issues or ideas that square the circle between traditional conservative orthodoxy and a realignment voter
yeah.
coalition?
Well, thank you for remembering that book. You're one of the few who does. So my message, my big idea of the past now getting on 20 years has been that I want to save free markets. I want to save free enterprise. I want to save limited government. And you do that by making some concessions to some of the negative consequences that those things have in an era of ultra globalization. Um, people, we used to soften the shock of free markets, and they can be shocking and upsetting for many people, with a big state, with labor unions, and those things have come under pressure. And so, what can we do instead? The American Republicans have made the choice with Trump to jettison. They are now a protectionist party. They're now a party of highly partial. The government is not any smaller than it was before. They remain as fiscally loose as they were before, big deficits. But Trump's idea is you're going to have a government that acts on behalf of his friends to punish his enemies. It's sort of Peronism. It's like anyway, it's everything that Friedrich Hayek warned against,
Yes.
and that's what it's going to be. And so I personally I have remained a registered Republican um, through the Tea Party, which I didn't like, through Trump won, which I didn't like, through this election cycle, hoping that there was a small role I could play in making the party a party of freedom again. And I think this election means that path is closed. So I've deregistered because I'm for alliances, I'm for trade, I'm for impartial government, I'm for the rule of law. Trump is against all of those things, and he's now the accepted leader. And the stamp he's put, and this is going to take us to some of the implications for Canada, because right of center parties through the world, first, the American Party catches their eye, and they will want to emulate that. And second, the supporters consume the same kind of media. Um,
Yes.
Joe Rogan and Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson are big deals in Canada too, and they are remaking. One of the questions that any future conservative government of Canada is going to have is, can it be pro-Ukraine when its supporters absorb pro-Russian media? And that's going to be a big question mark. And many in Canadian politics have already observed how the Canadian conservative voting base is ever more strikingly pro-Russia, and how even the local versions of Canadian conservative media follow with the pro-Russia message of their U.S. counterparts.
We'll come to that in a moment, but I do want to stay on this point about the trajectory, not just of the Republican Party, but conservatism more
Yeah.
generally. One subject that we've discussed before is, as you say, David, the extent to which this election campaign and the broader milieu represents a step away from your politics, and I'd say my politics, a basic small L liberalism that reflects free markets, trade, limited government, economic dynamism, etc. If this result, as you say, does indeed represent a departure from those ideas, what do you think has contributed to it? And more importantly, how do we go about rebuilding the case for free enterprise and a coalition that's prepared to support it?
Many, many years ago, I gave a talk in Windsor, Ontario, and I was put up. I gave a talk in Detroit, and I gave a talk in Detroit, and I was put up at the hotel over the casino in Windsor,
Mm.
Ontario. And this is at a time when the auto industry was very depressed. There's a lot of unemployment. And the manager of the hotel told me he just was unable to hire people. And you think, well, you've got like so much unemployment. How is it you can't hire people? He said, well, the problem is that what he needs are people with soft skills. He needs people who smile. He needs people who uh, are sensitive to the needs of others. And when you have a lot of laid off Canadian auto workers, the motto of the Canadian Auto Workers Union was never service with a smile. Uh, and so the problem, I think that maybe the core problem that conservative politics faces is the attributes that make you successful in the new globalized market economy are soft skills that tend to be associated with high levels with female sex, high levels of education, generally a liberal outlook. So the people of the culturally conservative outlook tend not to have the skills to flourish in a free market economy. The people who have the skills to flourish in a free market economy tend not to have culturally conservative outlooks, and so conservative parties see that if that their attitudes and values are driving out the people with the skills who are succeeding and attracting the people who don't have the skills, and so conservative voters are ever more skeptical about the modern economy, and that's a problem. As you're kind enough to remember, I was writing in 2007. Either the policies are going to come in line with the values, or the values are going to come in line with the policies. And what Trump is about is, you know what, you know, we are going to concede. Um, we're going to retreat from free markets because our voters don't like them.
So if I could push you on that though, David, because of course that approach is obviously objectionable to me and you, and I suspect a lot of our listeners and viewers. But if you wanted to do the alternative, which is to say to try to bring the policies into some alignment with this evolving nature of center
Yeah.
right politics around the world, how do you do it in a way that doesn't involve major trade-offs when it comes to one's values and
Yeah.
priorities? Are there certain issues, for instance, where you could square the circle between a conventional conservative orthodoxy and the interests of the types of people that you're talking about?
One of the messages of the 2024 campaign is that voters don't care about issues even slightly. They care about affect. Um, that they care that uh, you know Biden went out to deliver everything that working class voters are supposed to want, from rural internet to he protected the Teamsters pension fund. He did all kinds of things to support Build in America, much more than Donald Trump ever did. And it turns out his voters, the voters he wanted, didn't care about any of that. What they cared about was swagger and demeanor, and because of course the problem is when you're saying, how do I win back? What policies can win back people who are disengaged from the political system? And the answer is none, because they don't know that you've done it and they don't care about the result. They can't connect what you've done to what's happening in their lives. Um, and, when Donald Trump says, the reason you should vote for me is high prices. And okay, and what are you going to do? And I'm going to put a tax on everything imported into every good and input imported into the United States. A vote for Donald Trump was a vote for higher prices. But people didn't connect that. So I think look, this is one of the things that Ron DeSantis was trying to do, which is maybe if I'm just kind of an obnoxious bully, I don't have to change any of my policies because what people are, and although he wasn't able to execute that, and his obnoxious bullying often seemed kind of petty and stupid, he may have been onto something that picking fights with the Disney Corporation. I mean, from a conservative point of view, that's the beauty of the transgender issue. Um, Here's an issue that affects almost nobody, um, but that everybody has an opinion about, and that sets you up to be a sort of swaggering defender of cultural conservatism in a way that actually has very few real world consequences for more than like a small fraction of 1% of the population. And you'll notice that Trump spent tens of millions of dollars in his final push talking about this issue. It's one that doesn't impinge on a lot of people in any personal way, but it was his way of signaling, you know what, I'm a big tough guy, and you want a big tough guy, right? And meanwhile, I'm going to bring down the prices by putting a tax on everything imported into the United States.
Well, let's take up that issue, and in particular, what it means for Canada. I'm in Ottawa speaking to you today. There's obviously a lot of focus on the possibility of sweeping tariffs that could disrupt the world trading system, and ones targeting Canada in particular, both of which could have the effect of harming Canada's economy. What's your sense, David? Are these tariffs a bargaining chip that represents leverage vis-a-vis other countries, or are they more core to Trump's agenda and priorities?
Trump has been an advocate of tariffs since the 1980s. The key to understanding Donald Trump as his bio, the two, I've talked about this with a lot of people who've worked closely with him, including his ghostwriters and other people who've known him well. Trump does not believe that there is such a thing as a mutual gain from trade.
Yeah.
There's a winner, there's a loser. There's someone who dominates and someone who is dominated. There's a smart guy, a tough guy, a killer, and a sucker. So the the premise behind markets at home and abroad, he doesn't believe in it. So this is he sees himself as a tough. Look at his words that are praised: vicious, killer, brutal. Those are all good words for him. So yes, he believes in these tariffs, and he has broad authority to impose them. So the first impact of this election for Canada is the world trading system is in more trouble today than at any time since the 1930s. And USMCA is in trouble, and Canada is going to have to make some very difficult choices to keep alive USMCA. It is going to have to acquiesce to
Yes.
USMCA becoming a protectionist bloc in the world, and it's going to have to do this with no partner in Mexico. And Canada's had to negotiate these things before. There are people in Mexico you could sort of talk to, and form a common Canada-Mexico front. With the new hyper xenophobic, hyper statist, hyper left Mexican government, they're going to be more in alignment with Trump, because he's going to make possible their vision of a much more state-led, state-planned economy. So the first implication of Canada is that the North American trade system is in trouble, the world trade system is in trouble, and Canada is going to have to consider either acquiescence or some very radical steps. And at some point, the choice Canada may have to choose between keeping open the benefits it gets from USMCA and trading freely with the rest of the world. Back in the 80s, when I was a big advocate of the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, what was true then was we said you can have this. The best argument of the people who were against that original agreement was we want to trade with everybody, not just with the United States. And people like me would say, well, look, read the agreement. You can do both. You don't have to choose. You can have improved access to the US market and still trade in freedom with the rest of the world. But that choice is going to present itself, I think, under Trump, and it's going to be a difficult one for Canada. The second consequence for Canada, and I took notes, so I've got 5 points here. The second
Please.
consequence for Canada is Canada's about to have a border crisis. Um, Trump is going to at least start. I don't know that he's ever going to follow through on his full plan, because I don't think he's really reckoned with what it will look like to round up, detain, and deport people who millions of people when you don't know what country they came from, when their host government is not going to cooperate. I mean, just what are the mechanics of finding a Venezuelan and putting that person back, sending that person back to Venezuela? They're going to end up in camps. And no one's going to like that. And it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be nasty. It's going to be ugly. The plan probably breaks down. But in its early months, a lot of people from Venezuela, from Haiti, who are in the United States, who are nervous about their future, are going to try to cross the border into Canada. And I'm
Yes.
talking many people. So Canada's seen this before, but it's now really going to get it. Thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even more, walking across the Canadian border from the United States looking for status in Canada that they can't have in the United States. So trade crisis, border crisis. Um, Third consequence, um, Trump's going to sell out Ukraine. And that's going to be a giant crisis in NATO. And Canadian governments tend not to care, because Canadian governments tend to take the view the Americans have no option but the defense of Canada. But the reason that that's always seemed attractive is American governments have tended to be polite about Canada having no security options. Trump is never polite. The Trump message is, we'll protect you, fine. You do what we say. And you salute and you grovel. And the future of NATO is very dark. The future of Ukraine is very dark. And the message that Trump sends on Ukraine, that some of the more hallucinogenic Trump people think you can be soft on Ukraine and tough on Taiwan. You'd have to, again, that's an hallucination. Everyone will see the United States is not defending embattled democracies far from its borders. Ukraine was up against a weak aggressor, comparatively weak aggressor. Taiwan is up against the most powerful predator in the world, and Trump has no regard for them either, and he said so. So there are going to be these abandonments, and Canada is going to have to adjust to a world in which the United States security umbrella is a lot more porous than it used to be.
Yes.
The fourth thing, and some Canadians may regard this as positive, is environmental development in the United States is going to stop. The pressure to make a transition away from fossil fuels is going to stop. And so anyone in Canada who benefits from a relaxation of green energy activity in the United States is going to benefit. Anyone in Canada who suffers from it is going to suffer. But that's a big consequence that is going to be felt. And the last thing, the fifth point, so the first, trade, borders, Ukraine specifically, NATO more broadly, lack of green energy. The fifth is there's going to be a giant acceleration of pressure and glamour about the Trumpification of the Canadian Conservative Party. And now Canadian Conservatives are going to have to figure out, what does Trumpification mean? Is it style? Is it substance? But we've seen this in the UK. I think we're about to see it in Canada, that at a minimum, it's just going to mean ruder, more offensive politics. At a maximum, it means more pro-Russia, more protectionism, more fear of the outside world.
Let's stay on that precise point, because I know it's something that conservatives here are thinking about. We're likely to see the Liberal Party attempt to equate conservative leader Pierre Poilievre with Donald Trump in the minds of Canadians.
Yeah.
What, if anything, should he do to push back against those efforts?
Well, some of the decisions have already been made and may be too late. One is he needs to recruit as many female candidates as possible and make sure they have the most advantageous possible seats at the table. Is one of the things one of the ways you could explain what's the Trump message: boys rule, girls rule. And so you need to make clear, okay, in our conservative party, we don't think that way. The second, and this will be challenging, is to practice what used to be called the politics of respect. And if there's one thing that Trump is about, it's the politics of strategic and tactical disrespect. And I think that's appealing to a lot of conservative voters, and it's appealing to a lot of conservative practitioners, because the problem is, look, the people who are attracted to conservative politics, you recruit from the people who are attracted. And if the people who are attracted are people who say, finally, I get to say all those things I've wanted to say, and the liberals told me I shouldn't, that's who your candidates are going to be. So real enforcement of a politics of respect. And then Canadians just have to, and this part will be a little easier. Protectionism doesn't work for anybody,
Yes.
but it especially doesn't work for Canada. And the need to keep alive trade. Canada it's a northern country with fantastic natural resources. There are a lot of things you can build in Canada, and there are a lot of things you can't. If you're interested in eating fruits and vegetables, they're going to be imported. And it's going to just make sense for Canada to focus on its comparative advantages, and to use those to develop wealth that then buys the things at which it doesn't have comparative advantages. And that's just obvious if you're in Canada. But there's going to be a lot of tendency in the Conservative Party to think of made in Canada as something that they need to promote. And again, made in USA, bad idea. Made in Canada, worse idea.
A final question, David, as we look forward. One of the biggest decisions that the administration will need to make, working alongside the new Congress, is what to do with the tax cuts from the first Trump term. It seems implausible that they'll let them expire. In fact, it's even possible that they deepen them, which would presumably have implications for Canadian competitiveness. Talk about the extent to which the best defense for Canada may be a strong offense, which is to say, if there was ever a time to recommit ourselves to a competitivist agenda that draws on, say, the spirit of the
Yeah.
Irish example, it's now.
Yeah. Well, still don't know whether the House will be Republican or Democrat. Right. I think right now it looks like it will probably be a tiny majority for the Republicans, but that's still uncertain. Um, if it's one of the things we saw in the last session of Congress was it's not clear that that this Republican Congress can pass anything,
Yes.
even a tax cut, because Trump made a lot of pretty crazy promises. No tax on overtime, no tax on tips, no tax on right now, Social Security income is taxed if the recipient has over a certain level. Trump's promised to get rid of that. No tax on Social Security for upper income Social Security recipients. At the same time, as he extends these giant tax cuts for the very rich, and uh, if he tries to do that, the deficit projections are going to be terrifying.
Yes.
And by the way, one of the rules is the way you make a fiscal plan non-filibuster proof in the Senate, and the Republican Senate wants to defend the filibuster, which means that the plan needs 60 votes, not 51, to pass, is by making sure it's deficit neutral over 10 years. How they're going to do that. One way they may try to do that is by larding the plan up with a lot of offsetting tariffs, which they will claim falsely will generate a lot of revenue, um, and then manipulate the projections of the revenue from the tariffs. Um, it's going to be a problem for Canada. And I just don't think there's a way to sugarcoat this. I want to say one last thing. What is coming is going to be the most corrupt administration that America has seen since the 19th century, maybe ever. And that gives a lot of advantages to countries that are able to pay bribes. And Canadian culture, Canadian values, Canadian law makes it difficult for Canadians to pay bribes, as it should. And so a lot of the tax code is going to be laden with special advantages aimed at global oligarchs. And again, it's going to be difficult to compete with that for Canada. Obviously, Canada needs a lower corporate tax regime, needs a lower capital gains tax regime. Um, but it needs that for its own reasons. Um, and I think what is going to happen in the United States, it's just going to be, I think Canadians are going to find the spectacle of the next 4 years very off-putting. And the argument, vote for me because I'm going to have a better relationship with Trump. There may be some truth to that. I think it's going to be hard for Canadians to accept because, people are motivated by dignity too. And what is going to be asked of Canadian politicians is going to be quite degrading.
That's a sober way to wrap up our conversation, David, but a lot of food for thought for our audience on what is a pretty historic week. I want to thank you for joining me. I look forward to catching up next week, in fact, in Calgary, where we're doing
Yeah.
an event for Hub subscribers and other members of the Hub community. And until then, thank you so much for joining us.
See you in person soon. Bye bye.